Fellas, this week is obviously Brandon Royval versus Tatsuro Taira in a Fight Night main event. And I'm going to be breaking down every fighter on the card as well as my own personal predictions. Now, my prediction record for the last card, UFC 307, it was 8-4, not the greatest record, but to be fair, notoriously that card had a lot of bad calls on it, so I don't really count. You know, I'm just trying to do anything I can to make my predictions look good. But we'll start off with the first fight, Clayton Carpenter versus Rocha. Yeah, Clayton Carpenter, he came from the Contender Series, had a really good finish on the had a really good win on the Contender Series, and he's looked really good so far in the UFC. He's a really good grappler as well, and even before the UFC, the dude was on an absolute tear, and he's just had a really good start to his UFC career. But the problem is he hasn't fought all the way since the Jessica on George versus Blankfield card, which is all the way back in February of 2023, so he's been out for ages. A lot of people have forgotten about him. He's going to be taking on Rocha, who had a really good flash knockout as well in the Contender Series, and even out before the UFC in the Contender Series, this dude was on an absolute tear and he's managed to get a record of 17-1 because of that. So I think it's going to be a good fight between two I don't want to call them prospects at this moment in time, but two kind of up-and-comers who came from the Contender Series. But I'm going to be going with Clayton Carpenter to win this fight by decision. I really am a big fan of Clayton Carpenter's grappling. I know that Roch is a big prospect outside the UFC, but Carpenter's looked amazing. He's an amazing grappler, and I'm leaning towards him by decision. I think he's going to take Lucas Rocha down, and I think he's going to do enough across the 3 rounds to be able to not necessarily submit Rocha, because I know the dude's got talent, but I'm going to say that he gets it done by decision. I'm going Clayton Carpenter by decision. I think this guy's actually got quite a bit of potential as well. Does Clayton Carpenter to go quite far in the UFC, so I'm going to go with Clayton Carpenter to win this one by decision. Then we have Argueta versus Cody Hadden. Now, Argueta lost on the Contender Series in his UFC debut to Damon Jackson, then ended up getting a win over Nick Aguirre. Then he had 2 straight no contests, and then in his last fight he got choked out unconscious, so he's had a bit of a downward spiral in his UFC career, but he's still a good grappler. He's going to be taking on Cody Hadden, who is another really good grappler who came from the Contender Series as well. And he's just basically been on a tear outside the UFC as well, with only straight finishes, with his only loss being to Steve Erceg himself. So I think this is actually quite a good fight as well, but I'm going to go with Cody Hadden to win this fight by decision. I think he's a big favourite going into this fight. I know a lot of people are very fond of Argueta's grappling. I know he's a really good grappler, and he's high-paced and everything, but I'm going to go with Cody Hadden. He's a good prospect. He's also a really, really high-paced fighter, just like Argueta, but I feel like he's more well-rounded and he will get the job done. I feel like he can keep it on the feet, unlike Argueta, and I feel like his grappling game is equally as good, if not better. I think his jiu-jitsu is definitely better. Maybe not the wrestling, but his jiu-jitsu is definitely better than Argueta's. I'm going to be going with Cody Hadden to win this one by decision. And then we've got quite possibly my favourite fight on the prelims, Chris Barnett versus Junior Tafa. I love it when sometimes we get to see a fight between two heavyweights that are just shit, but they just make for a good fight. This is one of those fights, you know, enough of the prospects, enough of the up-and-comers. Let's see some 2 heavyweights go at it. Chris Barnett versus Junior Tafa. Obviously, this was supposed to be Waldo Cortez Acosta versus Chris Barnett, but I actually think this match is kind of better. Chris Barnett, obviously, one of my favourite heavyweights. The dude is charismatic. The dude's dancing in his walkouts, casually just sleeps someone and starts dancing on their grave. He had that famous roundhouse kick where he beat Gian Vigilante, and then had that massive backflip, which kind of arguably one of the best knockouts in heavyweight history. And he also had that big comeback when he fought Jake Collier and got that finish over Jake Collier. But he has lost twice in his UFC debut. He has lost twice in the UFC. Lost in his UFC debut to Ben Rothwell, and he broke his rib, I think, against Martin Badai, which ended up getting stopped. He's going to be taking on Junior Tafa on short notice, who in his recent fight got submitted by Valter Walker, the brother of Johnny Walker. He got finished by Marcos Rigueiro de Lima on short notice, and he got beaten by Mohamed Usman as well. He did get a knockout over Parker Porter, the same guy that his brother's beaten, but Parker Porter's not in the UFC anymore. And I also didn't like how after the fight with Valter Walker, he started shoving him after the fight. I'm kind of surprised he's still in the UFC, to be fair. I think if he loses this one, he might get cut. And I'm actually going to be signing with Chris Barnett by TKO in the second round. I know a lot of people are kind of thinking that Junior Tafa's going to get this one done, but I think when it comes to a pure striking matchup, unironically, Chris Barnett is actually quite athletic. I know it doesn't seem like it with his physique, but the dude's actually got really good taekwondo if you watch his fights, and it really impressed me how he faced a lot of adversity early on in that Jake Collier fight and was able to get a big comeback as well. I really do feel like Chris Barnett's got this one in the bag. I think Junior Tafa could land a big shot, but I'm honestly saddened with Chris Barnett in this one. I mean, you look at both his losses in the UFC, he got submitted by Ben Rothwell. There's going to be no submission threat from Junior Tafa, and he got held up against the cage and broke his rib against Martin Badai. I think when it comes to a pure striking matchup, I honestly favour Chris Barnett going into this fight, which is good because I think this is a much more favourable fight for Chris Barnett, and it's on short notice for Junior Tafa. And the last time he fought on short notice, he got battered by Marcos Rigueiro de Lima. So I'm going to be going with Chris Barnett to win this one, and I'm going to say he gets it done by TKO in the second round, straight into a backflip. It's a shame there's no crowd there because I feel like Chris Barnett and a crowd goes hand in hand, but it is what it is. Then we've got Nico Price versus Temba Gorimbo. Nico Price, bit of an old head in the UFC, lost more fights than he's won, debuted in the UFC in 2016, and he's just lost to a lot of guys. Lost to Michel Pereira, Luque, recently got that brutal finish against Robbie Lawler, got finished by Phil Rowe as well, and his last fight against Alex Morono was one of the lowest level fights I've seen in a while for a UFC main card on UFC 302. He's going to be taking on Gorimbo, who's kind of only known for getting gifted a house by The Rock. That's kind of how he's got all his hype in the UFC, and he's 3-1 in the UFC. And he's had some good wins and he doesn't look too bad, but I feel like he's a bit of a can crusher. He beat Pete Rodriguez, but Pete Rodriguez was 1-2 in the UFC, and his only win is over Mike Jackson, the same guy that barely beat CM Punk. Then in his last fight, he fought a guy that's lost 3 times in the UFC and only won twice. Then in his UFC debut against Sato, he fought Sato when Sato was on a 3-fight losing streak, 2 of them coming by way of finish. So I feel like he's a bit of a can crusher, is Gorimbo. I want to get hyped on him because he is a good grappler and he's actually got power. And I am going to be picking him to win this fight by decision because I feel like Nico Price is another one of those can crushers. You beat Nico Price, let's cut Nico Price. So it's a good, I guess it is a step up from Gorimbo, but yeah, he's a good grappler. He's not the most entertaining to watch. He's quite powerful on the feet as well. And Nico Price, I just don't really think he belongs in the UFC anymore. I know we came off that short notice win over Alex Morono, but beating Alex Morono in 2024 doesn't really mean much. Then we've got quite a good grappling matchup between Jonathan Pearce and Pat Sabatini, which I know a lot of people have had bad things to say about this fight, but I'm actually a fan of this fight. I think it could be a good grappling matchup. You've got Jonathan Pearce, who, apart from being known for being a lookalike from Khabib, started his UFC career, got a good UFC debut where he finished his opponent. Then he ended up getting absolutely destroyed by Joe Lauzon, the legend, in just his second fight. Then he went on a big winning streak, a 5-fight winning streak, beating the likes of Christian Rodriguez and Amir Khani, which was some good wins. And he kind of just continued that streak, just finishing opponent after opponent. And then he eventually ran into Joanderson Brito, and he was actually winning that fight with Joanderson Brito. And if he had beaten Brito, which he nearly did, he would have got a ranked fight. And then he started being cocky to Joanderson Brito, started getting too confident, and then eventually got submitted by ninja choke by Joanderson Brito in that fight and celebrated a little bit too early. And he lost his last fight as well to David Onamo, which was quite a fun fight, to be fair. He's going to be taking on Pat Sabatini, who had 4 straight wins in the beginning of his UFC career. Then he ended up getting knocked out, went and did a bit of grappling with Alex Caceres and actually won the grappling match. Then he ended up getting another win in the UFC just to then get absolutely bum-rushed by Diego Lopez. And since then, he's gone back to grappling, and he actually submitted Nico Price in grappling as well. So we've got 2 kind of high-level grapplers going at it, but I am going to be going with Jonathan Pearce to win this fight. Listen, I'm a big fan of the grappling of Pat Sabatini, and I do think that Sabatini's got really good Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, but I feel like that's all he's really got going for him, whereas I think Jonathan Pearce, I think he's got better stand-up than Pat Sabatini, and I also think he's got better pure wrestling, and he's a pure, well-rounded, better grappler than Pat Sabatini. So I'm going to be picking him to win by decision. I think there's a small chance that Pat Sabatini can pull a submission off, just like Joanderson Brito did, because he is a good submission artist. I really do think he is, but this is MMA, it's not Jiu-Jitsu, and I just feel like Jonathan Pearce is more well-rounded, and he's impressed me with more fights than Pat Sabatini has in the UFC so far. So I am going to be going with Jonathan Pearce to win this fight by decision. Then we have Vergara versus Temirov. Now, Vergara had a good start to his UFC career, winning on the Contender Series, and then he's only really lost to a lot of the top guys as well. He lost to Eddie Osborne, he lost to Tatsuro Taira, lost to Azu Almabayev, so he's had a bit of an up and down UFC career as Vergara, so it's kind of hard to call where he is. And he's going to be taking on Temirov, who he's on an absolute tear outside the UFC with a shit ton of finishes. This dude is a big prospect. He's not fought on the Contender Series, he's not fought in the UFC, but he's a big prospect coming into the UFC. So I am going to be going with Temirov to win this one by knockout in the first round. Again, he's not fought in the UFC, but if you look at his fights outside the UFC, he's really impressed me. He's a very powerful guy on the feet for a flyweight as well, and he's really well-rounded. I think he can win any way he wants, and I'm going to pick him to win by knockout in the first round. I think he's going to go far in the flyweight division. He's dangerous everywhere the fight goes. I think he's got a ton of potential in this division, so I'm going to go with Temirov to win this one by knockout in the first round against Vergara. And then we've got Njokuani versus Jared Gooden. Njokuani, this dude came from the Contender Series, got a really good knockout in his his Contender Series debut, then ended up getting 2 straight wins by finishing his UFC career. Started off his UFC career quite well, went on a 3-fight losing streak, losing to the likes of Mikal and Gregory Rodriguez, and in his last fight against Reese McKee, he got another win back in the winning column. He's going to be taking on Jared Gooden, who actually had a UFC run a couple of years ago. He went 1-3 in the UFC, ended up getting cut. Then outside the UFC, went 4-1 with a couple of finishes on there as well. Got brought back to the UFC, lost his comeback fight to the UFC, but then in his last fight, he got a submission win over Turman. in a fight that I would say he was losing. It should be quite a fun fight to watch stylistically, but I'm going to go with Njokuani to win this one by TKO in the 3rd round. I think he's got really good kickboxing, Njokuani. I think he's a really good Thai boxer. His kickboxing's really impressive, and he's actually very dangerous as well. I just think the problem is his fight IQ, and he kind of struggles with grapplers. And when it comes to Jared Gooden, the dude's powerful. I just don't think he's that good of a striker. I think he's a bit of a mid-fighter. I think if he loses this one, he's going to get cut from the UFC as well, like he did before. So I am going to be going with Njokuani to win this one by TKO in the 3rd round. I think he's going to break down Jared Gooden. Eventually, Jared Gooden's going to be too gassed, and I can just see Njokuani getting a finish in that 2nd or that 3rd round, and I'm going to say he gets the TKO in the 3rd. But I think this fight has potential to be good because they are 2 heavy hitters. They are 2 pretty good strikers as well, but I'm going to go with Njokuani to win this one. Then we have Joshua Fremd versus Alhassan. This should actually be quite a good fight. You've got Josh Fremd, who outside the UFC was on a bit of a tear with his only loss being to Mr. Gregory Rodriguez himself. Came into the UFC, lost his first 2 fights to Trezeguet Gore and Anthony Hernandez. Then he ended up picking 2 straight wins over Jamie Pickett and Cedric Damas, which was actually quite good. And he ended up losing his last 2 fights as well on a 2-fight losing streak. Got finished by Roman Kopylov and lost to Andre Petroski as well. So it was a bit of a streaky fight. He's going to be taking on Alhassan, who actually has a 100% win knockout rate in all of his wins. So every time he's ever won a fight, he's all come by way of knockout. This dude is an absolute powerhouse. Before the UFC, the dude was on a streak of just 1st-round knockouts. Got the UFC's attention. Came over to the UFC. Went 4-1 in the UFC with 4 first-round knockouts. Again, this dude is an absolute powerhouse. He was able to finish Nico Price as well. Then he went on a bit of a downward tear, lost a bit of his height, went on a 3-fight losing streak, got finished by Chaos Williams. But this dude, he's just an absolute monster on the feet. He's so dangerous. He ended up winning his next fight after that losing streak. Then he fought Buckley, lost that fight. Then he got a finish in his next fight. Then he ended up fighting Joe Pyfer, got lost in that fight. And then he got in his last fight against Cody Brundage, went to a no contest, and now he's going to be taking on Josh Fremd. I'm going to be going with Alhassan to win this one by knockout in the 1st round. Alhassan, I think this dude's an absolute beast. I know he's like nearly 40 years old, but this dude is an absolute powerhouse. He hits like an absolute truck. He's one of the most dangerous unranked dudes in the middleweight division right now. Joshua Fremd is just not consistent enough. He's not terrible anywhere, but he's not great anywhere. I feel like you can't really afford to be that type of fighter when you're facing Alhassan. And if you look at Alhassan's most recent losses, I mean, he's lost to Joe Pyfer, who's probably going to be ranked soon, and Buckley, who's, I know that was in the middleweight division, but he lost to Buckley, who's now like a top 10 welterweight as well. So I'm going to be going with Alhassan to knock him out in the 1st round. He's extremely dangerous, and I'm not really bought on Joshua Fremd. He beat Cedric Damas, which is the only good win in the UFC. Jamie Pickett, I don't even think he's in the UFC anymore. I'm going to go Alhassan to win this one by knockout in the 1st round. Then we've got Daniel Rodriguez versus Alex Morono. Daniel Rodriguez had a good start to his UFC career, went 5-0 in the UFC with a couple of finishes as well. Was actually kind of hyped up as being a prospect, ended up getting a finish over Dwight Grant as well. And then ended up losing to Nicolas Dalby by a fairly close decision, which isn't a shame because Nicolas Dalby's pretty good as well. Then he went on another winning streak, beating the likes of Mike Perry and Kevin Lee. And he also beat Li Jingliang, but I'm not a massive fan of that decision over Li Jingliang. I thought Li Jingliang should have won that fight. I know it was on like 12 hours notice, that fight, but I would have given Li Jingliang that win. And since then, he ended up getting submitted by Neil Magny, finished by Ian Gary, popping for steroids, and then he also lost to Kelvin Gastelum in his last fight. He's going to be taking on Alex Morono, who's also been in the UFC for ages. This dude's been in the UFC since 2016. Another old head like Nico Price. It just seems like he kind of just beats these old washed fighters, does Alex Morono. That's kind of who he relies winning on. Every time he faces someone good, he loses. I mean, he faced Nico Price, another washed guy in his last fight, and lost. He got finished by Ponzinibbio. He lost to Buckley as well. And you look at the last 6 guys he's beaten. A 39-year-old, a 40-year-old, a 39-year-old, and then the other 30-year-olds. I mean, who else did he? Mickey Gall, the dude who literally took a massive break from the UFC, and his best win was not his best win, but just Mickey Gall's not the most impressive win, is it? So in this fight, I'm going to be going with Daniel Rodriguez to win this one by decision. I feel like Alex Morono is near the end of his UFC career. He doesn't seem dangerous at all. He's only beating these old washed fighters. He can't put together a winning streak. He looked terrible against Nico Price in his last one. And even though Daniel Rodriguez isn't built for the top level either, I think he's at least a good fighter. I think he's got potential to beat up on some of these unranked guys, and I do think that Daniel Rodriguez will win a unanimous decision across 3 rounds. I don't really see this being too competitive. I mean, Rodriguez went toe-to-toe with Gastelum. He fought Ian Gary, who's now a top 6 undefeated flyweight, welterweight. And he lost to Neil Magny as well, who's the greatest gatekeeper. I'm going Rodriguez to win by decision. Then we have Corey McKenna versus Polastri. I'm not too sure why this is so high up on the main card. This is a prelim fight. Corey McKenna, there's not really much to say. Came from the Contender Series, got a win. Then she ended up going 3-2 in the UFC. I think she injured her arm in the last fight as well with terrible fight IQ. And she's going to be taking on Polastri, who also won in the Contender Series and then lost a UFC debut. I am going to be going with Corey McKenna to win this one by decision. I mean, she's much more experienced in the UFC. Polastri hasn't actually won a UFC fight yet. And I would say she's actually a pretty good grappler, is Corey McKenna. Even though her fight IQ and her striking could definitely be worked on, she's not too bad of a grappler. Whereas Polastri is also a pretty good grappler as well, but there's not really much information we can base it off considering she's had one fight in the UFC and lost. I'm going to be going with Corey McKenna to win this one by decision. And then we have Grant Dawson versus Rafa Garcia. Grant Dawson was once a massive prospect in the lightweight division. This dude was on an absolute tear of just straight wins. Well, he had a draw, or 2 draws. Well, he had a draw outside the UFC, but he had a draw in the UFC, and then he was on an absolute tear of just, you know, a bunch of wins. Hyped up as one of the best submission artists in the UFC. Made it to the top 10 of the lightweight division because he was just destroying people. His jiu-jitsu was amazing. He was an amazing grappler. Like I said before, people hyping up as if he's one of the best submission artists in the lightweight division. Then he got a fight night main event opportunity against Bobby Green, which would have progressed him in the top 10, and he got slept in 30 seconds against Bobby Green. He kind of got fraud checked, and he bounced back at UFC 302 with a win, but it wasn't the best win. It was pretty boring. He's going to be taking on Rafa Garcia, who came from, well, listen, Rafa Garcia is a good submission artist. He's not been too bad in his UFC career. He hasn't lost to terrible opponents, but at the same time, he's not really been able to beat anyone amazing. I mean, his most recent win was Clay Guida, and he hasn't fought since the Holloway versus Allen card, which was all the way in April of 2023. So I'm going to be going with Grant Dawson to submit him in the first round. I really am. Even though Grant Dawson's boring, he is a really good submission artist, and I honestly think he has a good chance of making it back into the lightweight rankings. He's boring, but I mean, he's only losses to Bobby Green in a fight night main event, which was his biggest step up in his UFC career at the time. And he got, okay, maybe he got finished in the first round, but still, I'm going to be picking him over Rafa Garcia, who's been extremely inactive. His last win was Clay Guida. I know Rafa Garcia's got good jiu-jitsu as well, but I feel like Grant Dawson, amazing grappler, amazing submission artist. Might not be the most interesting to watch, but I'm going to pick him to get this sub in the first round. And then we've got Brad Tavares versus Jung Young Park. This was scheduled early this year on the Lemos versus Jandiroba card, and it's now a rescheduled fight. Brad Tavares, this dude, started off his UFC career on The Ultimate Fighter. Had a pretty good run in The Ultimate Fighter, and then went on to win, go 5-1 in his next couple of fights in the UFC. And he's only really notably lost to the top guys like Romero, Adesanya, Whitaker, and Dricus du Plessis. And he hasn't really been looking amazing in his past couple of fights. I mean, his last win was Chris Weidman. This was the first fight that Weidman had after return from that leg injury. And he basically just attacked the leg of Weidman the entire fight, and Weidman's washed. He's going to be taking on Park, who lost his UFC debut to Anthony Hernandez. Then he went on a 3-fight winning streak. Then ended up losing again to Christian Rodriguez. Then went on a 4-fight winning streak with 3 straight rear naked chokes, and then he ended up losing his last fight to Andre Muniz. I'm going to be picking Park to win this one by decision. I think Park's just a better fighter. I think Tavares is on his way out, not necessarily on his way out, but I just don't really think he's one of these top unranked middleweights anymore. I think Park, I think he's much more well-rounded than Brad Tavares. He's got really good grappling, really good ground and pound, really good jiu-jitsu, but he's also quite good on the feet as well. His boxing's pretty crisp. And Brad Tavares, he just hasn't overly impressed me in these past couple of fights. I think he had the opportunity to finish Chris Weidman in a really quick amount of time in that fight, with how damaged Weidman's leg was and how affected he was by the leg kicks, and he didn't. He seems to be kind of towards the end of his career. I'm going with Park to win this one by decision. And then the main event, Brandon Royval versus Tatsuro Taira. Tatsuro Taira, I mean, he's 16-0, undefeated in the flyweight division, a big prospect in the flyweight division right now. And if he beats Brandon Royval, he's probably going to get a title shot. The dude has been on a tear in his UFC career so far, 4 finishes so far. In his last fight, he got a main event opportunity over Alex Perez, and even though it ended in injury, the dude looked so good with his jiu-jitsu in that fight. I think he's looked better than anyone else has in the flyweight division for a while, with the way that he was looking, just pure grappling with his jiu-jitsu in that fight. He's grappling, his jiu-jitsu just looked completely amazing. He's going to be taking on Brandon Royval. Started off his UFC career with 2 straight finishes over Kaikar France and Tim Elliott, who are both now ranked. And then he lost to some of the top flyweights in the world, Pantoja and Morono, also by finish. Then he goes on a 3-fight winning streak, beating the likes of Matt Schnell and Mateus Nicolau by finish as well. Then he gets a title shot against Pantoja at 296 last year, ends up losing that fight by decision. Then he gets a main event opportunity early this year against Brandon Moreno, gets an upset win over Brandon Moreno, gets back in the winning column, and now he's going to be taking on Tatsuro Taira. I'm actually leaning to Brandon Royval winning this one. I know a lot of people are picking Tatsuro Taira to win, but I actually think Royval's got way more ways to win than Tatsuro Taira. I think Royval's got an underrated submission game. Pantoja couldn't really threaten him with too much with the submissions. He went 5 rounds with Pantoja. He's much more experienced at the highest level than Tatsuro Taira. His best win is Alex Perez's Taira's. Royval's fought nearly everyone in the flyweight division. Like I said, he's fought for the belt. He's been 5 rounds with Pantoja, who is a much more... I'd say that Tatsuro Taira's got better jiu-jitsu than Pantoja, but I'd say that Pantoja's a more relentless grappler grappler and a tougher grappler to deal with than Tatsuro Taira, which Royval was looking good against. And he showed that he's got 5-round experience as well, because in that 5th round and that 4th round against what's his name? Alejandro Pantoja, Royval didn't actually look too bad. So I'm going to be picking him to win by decision. I think he's a much better striker as well as Taira. Listen, Taira's got good striking here, at least he's improved it a bit. But Brandon Royval's one of the most elusive boxers in this division. I think he's going to get a decision win. I'd be surprised if he gets a finish over Taira, unless he clips him really early on. I don't see him getting a finish. He's not the most powerful dude as Royval, but he's crafty, he's well-rounded, he's more experienced. I feel like I get it. Tatsuro Taira's got a lot of hype, but this isn't a favourable matchup for Taira. So I'm going to be going with Brandon Royval to get this one done by decision. But those are my predictions and my breakdown for UFC Tatsuro Taira versus Brandon Royval. Let me know your thoughts on this card and your personal predictions as well. Thank you for watching.